I designed and built a workbench recently. If you haven't seen the video, you probably want to check that out first. I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't tell you about a flaw that I found in my design roughly a month after I created it. That flaw is a sagging workbench top. So right in the front of it where the table saw platform sits, it has nothing to support it all the way across the beam. So what happened is the weight of the saw has actually pulled the workbench surface down probably 1/4 of an inch on both sides. And even that was 1/4 of an inch too much for me. So I want to take you through exactly how I fixed that, how I created the half lap joints, a couple of different methods that you can use to create half lap joints, and show you what the end is with it completely fixed and completely flat again. So actually I've used this workbench quite a bit since I built it, and I need to go ahead and vacuum underneath the saw. Because I stapled the electrical cord down on the inside of the leg, I need to pull all the staples out too so that I can work on this area, because this is where the support piece is going to be underneath the workbench. Next up, I've got to take out the backer board at the bottom. It was there to keep my screw holders upright, the DeWalt screw holders on the other side. Now, the easiest way for me to lift this up was to just get a jack under it. And in order to do that, I actually had to get a couple of the 4x4s, and these happen to be 4x4s that were left over from the cut of the workbench saw. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and clamp on this 2x4 at the exact spot I want once I get the saw lifted up to the level and the height that I want, so that I know exactly where I need to mount this 2x4 with half lap joints underneath the workbench. After I have the clamp in and the workbench at the right height, I can go ahead and mark those lines and then remove the board so that I can make the cut to insert the board into the half lap joints halfway up the workbench leg. I'm going to use the end of a 2x4 and a number 2 pencil to mark the outside of the 4x4 on how deep I need to cut the half lap joint out. And in this case, I'm using a right angle tool to help me measure the rest of that distance. As far as creating these half lap joints, there's a couple of ways that I could attack this. The first one that I'm showing here is one where I used a Sawzall and an extra long blade to make that cut all the way across the leg. Now, I made 2 cuts. I made 1 cut at the bottom of the joint that I needed and 1 cut at the top of the joint that I needed. And then I'm gonna go ahead and use the saw to cut out the rest of the half lap. Unfortunately, there's nothing keeping the saw level or plumb as I cut through the leg, because the plate that's on it moves and it doesn't exactly keep it level. So this type of cut has a chance at maybe being straight, but also it could be really crooked. And you'll see that my issue in here is that there was a knot. It was on one side of it that was giving the blade a little bit more trouble than it was on the other side of it. So ultimately, this wasn't the right approach for this area. I didn't actually know that this knot was in there, but it's what was giving me a headache as I tried to cut through the back side of it and make it even up and down. You're not going to see the inside of my half lap joint, so it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference to me, but I opted on the next joint to use a saw. A circular saw, yes, it's going to keep it level and flush all the way across. It's going to make the same depth cut all the way across. It just takes a lot more passes to get through the leg. But once I've made enough of those cuts all the way through, I can just use a chisel and a reciprocating saw to cut the back end of that to get a fairly even depth all the way across the half lap joint. The obvious best answer here would have been to just take the leg out somehow, because it wouldn't be easy, but to take the leg out and actually just run it through a dado or use a bandsaw of some sort or any number of things to make this. But I'm trying to do this fix after I built it. I think when you build your workbench, you should integrate these cuts in long before you get this far in the build process, so that you have a little bit more flexibility in what you can do with the legs and the half lap joint. Now, I do need to cut the 2x4 down to size, so it's basically 48 inches long, because the entire width of the workbench is 48 inches long. So I'm gonna go ahead and hack one end of that off and then fit it back in there where it's supposed to sit at the correct height once the half lap joints are done. After I'm finished, I'm gonna go ahead and jack the saw back up again after I pull the board out, so that I can fit the new support board inside of the half lap joint. I usually like to take a clamp and make sure that it's clamped in all the way, so that when I start screwing, the screws go in all the way through and don't have to pull the board, the piece of work material, into that half lap joint, but actually it's already clamped ahead of time, so I'm not doing any extra work to pull that in. As soon as I put the first screw in, the board is set at the depth that I want it set at. I just use 3 screws on each side, because I don't really need a whole lot, since the actual weight is being supported by the half lap joint and not the screws itself. You don't have to create half lap joints in your legs to do this, but as you've seen in this build, I like having things flushed and integrated into the workbench itself. I think it gives it a little bit of a cleaner look. I'm gonna go ahead and put the saw back in it and get my 48-inch sheetrock square out and measure it across the length of the desk again to make sure that it's set at the right height and it's not sagging anymore. If you look though just just on the end of my 48-inch square, there's a bump in the metal where it's been dropped at some point, so it's not quite level. I need to either grind that down or do something or hammer it out. But since I haven't done that yet, I can just turn it around backwards and try and use the level from the other side to make sure that it's completely flush all the way across the workbench top. So I do a ton of how I did it type videos. This is just one of them, and you know, I love bringing you this workbench. I love the feedback that I've gotten from so many of you on it. There's so many people that have clicked on it and watched it and loved it and commented and said, hey, this has been really great. But I also want to be completely honest with you that there was a mistake I made in building it, because I basically created it from my head out of scratch, and you're not going to get everything right the first time. And remember that when you do your build, you can make mistakes in there. It's okay to come back and fix them, and I'm the biggest person to admit that I made a mistake in that depth. Fortunately, it was an easy fix, and it's not something that, you know, long-term affected the structural integrity of the entire workbench. Suffices to say, I make a lot of these, I do a lot of different things. I've actually done a complete garage reorganization along with this workbench and created another workbench top, so I'll be coming up with that video soon. I also have some thoughts on 5 areas that you need to consider when you're making your own workbench, and I'm going to be creating a video on that too. So if you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.